Okay, so we are back for part two of our interview, and I will remind you that this is not a private conversation and will ultimately be made available to the public.
So don't cuss.
Or please cuss as much as possible. Let us know that you are people. Today is Thursday, July 7th, 2016. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm conducting a follow-up interview with Nan Orrock here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. Before we get going again, if I can just get your verbal confirmation that you're aware and consent to being recorded.
I'm aware and consent to being recorded.
Perfect. So last time we talked, we got a bit of your family background and youthful experiences, and we stopped somewhere around the time that you went to the 1963 March on Washington. And you have been interviewed several times by this department in the Women and Genders Collection project. And there, in some of those interviews, you spoke a good bit of your work with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and with SOC, the Southern Student Organizing Committee. So we'll sort of gloss over those years unless there are some things that you want to add to that. Where I'd like to start is, can you speak at all about the influence of any books or music, film, sort of cultural products of that era?
Well, yeah, a couple of highlights to that. In '63, the summer that I joined the March on Washington, I was living in Washington with my Aunt Margaret Irwin Moore, who was a congressman's secretary on the Hill, Congressman Howard Baker Sr. And that summer, I remember being very moved by hearing on the radio in her little apartment, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, but the Answer My Friend Is Blowing in the Wind, and being very moved by that music that was starting to hit the airwaves, and fast forward to 64, 65, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I highly recommend to this very day, and it had a great impact on me as far as deepening my understanding of the Black lives in America and the perspective of Malcolm X, because of course he was completely demonized in the popular media, popular press, and to have an opportunity to hear in his own words the things that shaped him and shaped his view and the stages that he went through and his perceptions and his decisions and his prison time and et cetera, et cetera. That book had a high impact on me. I was really galvanized by it. And if I thought about it some more, I could. And I will say to you, the music in the freedom movement in the Deep South was played an incredible role and touched me and countless others deeply, and was part of the fabric of resistance against oppression and determination to fight and lifting up ideals, lifting our voices in song. I mean, I was in rural black churches. I was in rallies. I was in and in SNCC we had the SNCC Freedom Singers, and I've maintained a lifelong friendship with Bernice Reagan, who went on to do incredible things. Was the curator of the African American exhibits at the Smithsonian, and actually convened us probably for the 10th anniversary in the 70s of the Freedom Summer, and pulled together displays and exhibits and music, but also was a backbone person in this group known as the SNCC Freedom Singers, and they actually raised money for the SNCC and the freedom work in the South with concerts, and had an album, The Freedom Singers Sing of Freedom Now, that was recorded at Carnegie Hall, I believe. And so the music of the freedom movement was determinative. I mean, it was a fundamental aspect of the movement in the South. Fundamental aspect. And I'll also say the recordings that the Lomax family, senior and junior, did of the chain gangs and field hands working in the South. All of that are that music out of those centuries of African American labor and imprisonment. That was has followed me for a lifetime as well. So, and all the folk singer movement stuff and the Pete Seeger efforts. I mean, I could go on and on, but the music of those times, it was very, very important to me.
And what would you say that it did for you at that time?
Well, I mean, the power of art and the creative spirit, and music in particular, it was part of the fabric of the movement, and it was it brought people together, lifted people up, inspired people. I mean, we sang in jail when we were locked up in Laurel, Mississippi. I guess that was December of '64, after Freedom Summer, and before we started our project at Southside Virginia, the Virginia Student Civil Rights Committee. But we went down to Mississippi and took a big van full of donated clothing and supplies that we'd gathered up in Virginia with the college students that were working together on the campuses of Virginia as we were building our efforts to go into black belt counties in Virginia the next summer with the help of SNCC. But we were eating in an integrated, seeking service in a restaurant, and got locked up and sang all through that week of jail time that we had down there. Very high impact on me, the songs of the freedom movement. I sang them myself. I collected them. I learned them. I was that was very much a part of the civil rights experience, and those remain to this day highly significant to me. But movement was part of the backbone, and very linked to the black church experience, and drew on a lot of the music out of the black church that was adapted to inspire and hold up the bloodstained banner.
And in a previous interview, you mentioned that you first came to Atlanta. Was it in 1964 in the summer to work in the SNCC offices? Was that your first?
Yes, summer of '64. Actually, I was in the race relations committee of the YWCA on campus in Fredericksburg, Virginia, at Mary Washington College, and we the Y sponsored young women from campuses where they worked to come down for a weekend. It was Easter weekend of '64, and that's when and again, this has been covered in other interviews that I've done for the archives here, but it was that weekend we went to the historic Ebenezer Baptist, and Dr. King was doing a workshop in one of the basement Sunday school rooms. It was a workshop on nonviolence, as I recall. So that was an incredible thing to be there in the room with that. I mean, at the time, you didn't understand how incredible it was. But when you look back through the eyes of history, absolutely incredible. And it's where I met SNCC people for the first time and really heard of SNCC and learned of SNCC. One of the crew, Wilson Brown, was a printer for SNCC. He was a Korean War veteran and an older guy than a lot of us younger students, but he stayed in touch with me. He sent me everything that came off the press, the Student Voice. He actually, I believe, gave me that album of the SNCC Freedom Singers Sing of Freedom Now. But anything that they were publishing, he would send it up to me at college, when I went back to college, and I would share it with our group. And that's where I learned. We were trained in voter registration. We went out and door knocked in the old, what was called Buttermilk Bottom, where the Civic Center is now in Atlanta, actually a part of my district that I represented as a senator. Who would have thought, decades later. But that was our weekend, our YWCA weekend in Atlanta, with an immersion into civil rights and voter registration. And it was defining because it put me in touch with SNCC. And I stayed in touch with SNCC folks and made plans to come down and work for SNCC in the summer of '64. I was not on a college campus in the North being recruited by SNCC or trained by SNCC like so many were, the 1,000 young people that were brought down to the Deep South, to Mississippi, for summer of '64. That was not the path that was there for Southerners. And but because I had come down with the Y to Atlanta, and that, as I said, was a defining moment, then came back that summer with another classmate who was an activist as well, and walked into a SNCC and went to work for him, and then spent part of the latter part of the summer in Mississippi, in Greenwood, Mississippi, in the Greenwood SNCC office, and then went back to campus to finish my senior year, thanks to my mom insisting that be the case. And we went on to organize and go into the Black Belt counties in Virginia in summer of '65. But then I moved back to Atlanta, by now married, to Jean Guerrero, and we moved back here in '67 because of his draft resistance case. This was where his draft board was. So that's my Atlanta. I was here for 3 months in the summer of '64, and then relocated here in '67 after having done finished college and done community organizing in 6 Black Belt counties in Virginia with a project that we ran that SNCC helped fund, and then from there worked with students with SOC, Southern Student Organizing Committee, which was based in Nashville and worked on campuses across the South, and we were recruiting Virginia students to come and work in our project on that model of Mississippi Summer. But we were organizing and recruiting off of Virginia campuses with a Black-White student organization in '65, and ultimately, as I said, I returned to Atlanta because we knew we were going to be in a long, drawn-out legal case as Jean resisted induction into the Army as a conscientious objector.
Can you tell me where you stayed in Atlanta, both in '64 and then when you came back in '67, and also describe what you remember of sort of the atmosphere or mood of the city, what you felt and experienced of the city as a place of so significant in the civil rights movement.
Well,
and the emerging anti-war movement that.
Yeah, we the sequence of things when we came down here for the weekend. Of course, the Y accommodated us. I don't even remember where, but when I came here for summer of '64, initially we just found a room at a boarding house in the black community. Erin Sims was my fellow college student from Mary Washington. Interestingly, her father was an FBI agent, I think, working out of Richmond, part of the huge slice of Irishmen who were FBI agents in that era, and we paid weekly rent at a boarding house briefly, and then
In what neighborhood?
I somewhere on the southwest side of town, but didn't stay there long enough to really have that fixed in my memory as to what location was, because I didn't know the city at that point. And the organization SNCC had a house where men stayed and an apartment where women stayed, and at some point I began staying there. People on the staff found me a place to stay in Grant Park. Are you familiar with this story? I don't know if you've read this in any of my accounts, but anyway, it's interesting. It was Celestine Sibley's daughter, who was married to a jazz musician, and they lived in an apartment in Grant Park, in an old house. And Maggie Long was Celestine Sibley's friend, and they were both liberal, white, Southern women. And through that connection with somebody knew Maggie Long who knew Celestine Sibley, so that's how I wound up being invited to have a bed at her daughter's apartment. And she had a little child in diapers. And it was an interesting thing because people from the office would drop me off there when it was time to go home. But it was very unsafe in Grant Park for people to be riding integrated in a car, black and white. Now you remember, this is the Grant Park where the city fathers, in all their wisdom, had poured concrete in the Grant Park pool in the 50s and shut it down in the wake of the Brown versus Board. And it might have been the 60s, I really don't know, but that pool was closed down and filled with concrete in order to stave off any efforts to integrate it. And that was the Grant Park was old, decaying mansions, the old Victorians that today sell for $1.5 million, but there was rent by the week. Low income people were there, working class white people were there in the main. It was not at all integrated. And so to drive, for black people to drive through that neighborhood with a white person in the car was definitely an act of courage. I mean, people didn't feel safe going into that neighborhood. So I didn't stay there for very long because it was so challenging to get me back and forth from that location to the office. And ultimately, I wound up sleeping at the apartment on Chestnut Street over off of Hunter Street, which is now known as Martin Luther King Drive. And that was the apartment that SNCC rented for. We call them freedom houses, but it was an apartment where people just shared beds and slept in shifts, and that's where I stayed most of the summer. And then when and so it was interesting. I mean, I remember distinctly that 4th of July. Some of us who worked, we were the young crew. You know, we were the kids that were barely 20 years old. A couple of summer volunteers from the north whose parents had insisted that they not go to Mississippi, and one kid who was still in high school. The rest of us were typically college, as well as SNCC workers that were assigned to that office for whatever reason. They might have come from somewhere else, but they were part of the backbone staff. You know, running the carpool, running the print and press, making the organization work. And so we would all pal around together. We were definitely the bottom tier. We were not in the senior staff meetings or anything like that with the top dogs. And I worked for Julian Bond in the communications department and did a lot of kind of press work and secretarial work. And we worked the night shift. And Julian had a younger brother, James, who was maybe just out of high school. He'd gone to a boarding school up north, I think. But he was there working alongside us as part of the night shift, and the younger crew. And so we would staff the phones, all night when the calls are coming in from Mississippi with the people that are really, in harm's way, being chased by cops or Klan, or going to investigate a burned out church, or being holed up in a house where community people had opened up their bedrooms for them to stay. All those calls, we took those calls at night and fielded them, and we kept a running account that was called the Watts Line, Wide Area Telephone Service, and all those accounts exist today of all that stuff coming in from the field that we gathered, both from Southwest Georgia and from Mississippi, and that 4th of July, we were stopped somewhere. We were going to go on an outing, on a 4th of July outing. It was an integrated group of the people that I've been describing, and we had a couple of cars and stopped somewhere and bought some chicken, and we're going to go to a lake somewhere and have a little picnic. And we actually drove up to Lake Lanier, and we got run off repeatedly when we tried to stop somewhere and get out of the car and have our picnic, at least twice by the local white folks, hostile guys in cars. So we literally had to come back to Atlanta to have our 4th of July chicken picnic. That's a very partial description of it, but it was incredibly dicey to be seen riding around in cars together in integrated groups in Atlanta, unless you were in the black community. I mean, as soon as you got out of the black community, you were the spotlight was on you. So Atlanta was like a small town then, and then I came back in '67 to Gene and I moved here to get ready for prepare for the court battle with the induction process at the old, over there on Ponce de Leon, where bright shiny new things are now. The Ponce Market is there now, but it was a recruiting station, an induction station for the U.S. Army back in the day.
And where did you all settle when you moved here?
Right up the street from that induction center, Penn Avenue, where the Penn Avenue and Myrtle, right off of Ponce de Leon. Again, now very pricey digs, but back then you could, get an apartment for a dime. So we were almost within the sight line of the blinking Krispy Kreme donut sign,
Mm-hmm.
just to place it for you on Ponce de Leon. Again, neighborhoods that I represent now in the Senate.
And what was that neighborhood like then?
Well, again, you could get it had been white flight and money leaving the city was well underway, and so you could get into neighborhoods like Morningside and around Piedmont Park for little or nothing, and the up there around 10th Street and Peachtree, which became known as the Strip, when we were putting out the Great Speckled Bird. All of that was virtually abandoned and undeveloped. And when I say abandoned, big old beautiful homes like proceeding from Piedmont Park on 10th Street up to Peachtree. I mean, there were big beautiful homes that were pretty much abandoned, boarded up, not even being used at all, or being rented out for a dime, divided up into apartments. So it was a very decimated area of the of Atlanta back then, and the area known as the Strip, young hippie type kids sold the bird on the Strip, and drugs and prostitution, just a very much an area in decline.
And what was the racial composition of that area in '67?
Racially, it was overwhelmingly white. Yeah, and that's where one of those big old decaying two-story homes was the birdhouse.
Mm-hmm. So from your experience...
Actually, that was on 14th Street, not 10th Street.
Mm-hmm. So from your experience the summer of '64, being over in southwest Atlanta with a little sojourn in Grant Park, and then to '67 being around Ponce Highland maybe area, how do you compare those in your head? Just a few years separating and two different neighborhoods. Did Atlanta feel the same in '67 as it did in '64?
Well, I was living in the black community in '64 and living in the white community in '67. So it was a different part of town. The SNCC headquarters were right. The office was over a dry cleaners, right, just 2 doors off of West Hunter Street, where the Tasty Dog and the Tibbs Pharmacy and the Busy Bee Cafe were all located. It was a busy black commercial area, and really, within view of downtown, and nestled right beside the Atlanta University complex, Morehouse, Spelman, and AU. And I mean, I've never reflected deeply on that to any extent, but yes, I did. And what was happening 67, 68, 69 was this emerging kind of youth cultural revolution, counterculture, rock is revolution, and the whole era of hippies, although I'm sure the South had a pale imitation of what hippies were, but that was a very different part of town when you think about that, because as I lived there in the late '60s, and we did our bird work, and located around in a couple of different locations with the bird, we were it was a changing terrain. Again, no development, no bright shiny new. Everything was on the decline, and a lot of scruffy kids around that were seen as street people and hippies and so on and so forth, and music in the park, Piedmont Park, Allman Brothers. So the counterculture aspect of society was very much represented there, where we were doing the bird work, where we were putting out the paper, and it was young kids who were living on the streets or living hand to mouth, or living with mom and dad and coming downtown on the weekends. Most the most modest version of it were around on the streets, and it was that's part of what was reflected in the pages of the Bird. We didn't plan that. It was a co-occurring event of this huge counterculture movement. We were hard-nosed politicos, those of us that started the Bird, who wanted to definitely speak out against the war in Vietnam and the corporate point of view represented in the Atlanta newspapers, and wanted to speak truth to power. It was alternative press, it was independent media, and that was our vision of what we were doing, and it was occurring in the midst of a youth culture phenomenon that we woke up to, at different points in time, different ones of us. But it was, an era of dope smoking and rock music and youth alienation and challenging the status quo, which is summed up so eloquently in the Bob Dylan verses of the time. So that was hugely significant to the course that the Bird took, and we had internal debate constantly around politics versus culture, kind of almost an artificial dichotomy. But there were Tom and Stephanie Coffin, Howard and Ann Romaine, Gene and Nan Guerrero, the six of us that were the early conceivers of the Bird. The view was to put out a political rag that was speaking truth to power. Now it attracted all this artists and music and counterculture influences, and that very much became part and parcel of the Bird. But there was always a creative tension between those two threads. How much graphic space? How much space for art? How much space for music? How much space for politics? That was never resolved. It was an ongoing internal conversation, to say the least.
When you moved here in 67, were any of your old friends and contacts from 64 still here? Were you still in contact with anybody from a few years previous?
We were, but I don't know at what point the SNCC office closed down, but there had been a great parting of the ways at Waveland when SNCC held the meeting where there was a big internal debate about the role of whites in the black movement. And I was not a permanent staffer on SNCC like somebody like Bob Zellner, Dottie Zellner, other people were whites from the North or from the South. But there was a great breaking apart that's still debated today by the folks that are able to lift up their gray heads and continue the debate. But the Black Power movement emerged. The Rap Brown became the head of SNCC, and the message was loud and clear that white people should be organizing in the white community, should be seeking to change the hearts and minds of white people. And so I don't even know if the SNCC office was still, it wasn't up and running by the time I got back here. But it certainly wasn't the same organization. It had whatever remained of the organization. I mean, people much closer to it in all those years than I can tell you firsthand accounts. But things had changed significantly between 64 and 68, 67, 68, in terms of there was plenty of activism. There was white activism, there was black activism, and there were all sorts of movement efforts that we participated in, that we covered for the Bird. But it was not something emanating from the SNCC office. There was not a connectivity there to any extent. Now, I did see individuals that were still around, but people had scattered out. There were friends that were doing GI organizing in Anniston that had been in the SNCC office. There'd been a great scattering of people, and this new effort that we got involved in putting out the newspaper certainly covered struggles in the African American community and racial issues, but there was a lot of division and separation. I'm speaking generally in those years. We in the project that SNCC helped us launch in Virginia before I moved to Atlanta. We continued on after the Waveland meeting, doing work as blacks and whites in the black community, challenging segregation and organizing people and supporting local leadership to be developed and put in some permanent infrastructure in the community. Best case scenario in some of the counties that we worked in, but there was great change, almost month by month, in the 60s, of what the trend line and where things were going. And of course, we were here living in Atlanta. I'm trying to think. Still in the Penn Avenue area, Myrtle Avenue, Penn Avenue, Myrtle Street and Penn Avenue, when Dr. King was assassinated. I lift that up to say the monumentally incredible upheaval that was going on across the nation. And the anti-war movement, heating up. And I went to my first anti-war demonstration with SNCC. SNCC was part of a picketing the White House. I'd be hard-pressed to pin down the year, but it was in SNCC that I came to understand, imperialism and the role of the U.S. in the world, kind of looking beyond our shores, and that huge conversation that emerged around, oppression of third world people and the U.S. role in it, and then who are the troops that are being recruited to put their lives on the line. All of that perspective I gained through SNCC.
And how and when did you and Jean meet?
I was in Southside Virginia. Southern Student Organizing Committee had been organized with the help, again, encouragement of SNCC, and with the encouragement of Ann Braden and Carl Braden from SCEF, Southern Conference Education Fund. And Jean was at Emory university as a student and participated in the demonstrations downtown, civil rights demonstrations at Leb's and other iconic restaurants, seeking to integrate those. And so that was his pathway into the movement, was as a college student at Emory. He was in Atlanta, went to high school here. He was from Texas. And so I met Gene through SOC because he was he was working as a SOC organizer, and I was traveling campuses in Virginia for our Virginia Student Civil Rights Committee, because we recruited students off the Virginia campuses to come and work in the communities where we were organizing. And so I combined roles of connecting students with SOC, which was a Southside organization, to reach out to white students on the segregated white campuses and be a place where progressive ideas and actions among white students were validated and encouraged and organized. And so Gene connected with the SOC at some point. I don't remember how, but I met him in SOC because I was campus traveling for SOC, and we started going to staff meetings together and that sort of stuff. We'd go over to Nashville. I was at a certain point being staff for Virginia Student Civil Rights Committee, where I was project director, and for SOC itself. And so that's how we met, was in the course of student activist work in the southern states. And we married in probably June of '66 at a SOC conference in Memphis, Tennessee. Yeah. And then by that fall, we were living in Nashville and working full time out of the SOC office. And the first thing, the big significant thing that we did, Gene was promoting alliance with labor and unions, and was very connected to the labor movement. And we actually, as SOC people, went to North Carolina to work with the Textile Workers Union. We were working to bring students into the support of the labor movement and connect students and labor activists and bring the synergy of both of those movements together. And that was a vision of what we were doing. And so we lived and worked in mill towns in North Carolina, the Cannon Mills, etc., Hall River Mills. There was a chain of old mills and that had locals in them, and the vision of the textile workers was to reactivate those locals and do it, building the synergy with the students, getting student support from campuses, and getting student activists involved in supporting labor. So that took us to North Carolina, and then a strike broke out in Whiteville, over near Wilmington, 60 miles west of Wilmington. And we worked there with a textile mill strike. And the labor lawyer who came up from Atlanta, Al Horn, also became the lawyer to represent Gene in his draft case. So we were in North Carolina, possibly 6 months or something like that, working for SOC and labor, and actually staffing this strike with the Textile Workers Union, which was the first time. It was very important and seminal for me in terms of my political development, because I had been working in black community settings as an ally and as a target of white reactionaries in those community settings. That was the most dangerous thing in the world, was to, let the white folks get a hold of you that were hostile to the civil rights efforts. And so I had that experience of viewing working class white people as a threat and a danger and a repository of reactionary ideas and actions. And so it was really significant for me to go into labor struggles where we were organizing workers, black and white, that were having their first integrated work experience in these mills in North Carolina, and black people were coming from an NAACP activism background, and white people were coming from a Klan background in these settings, and here they were together fighting union battles for a voice on the job and for a contract. So that was a very important experience for me to get the opportunity to understand the class questions and what was going on with white workers and the potential for unity and all of the dynamics that were unfolding with strong-willed African-American leaders in the plant and white workers in the plant, and them struggling to come together to work to build a union into a fighting force. It was incredibly important for me to step away from my experience of only seeing white working people as hostile and enemies of the black freedom movement, and understanding the class nature of the class struggle, and people both black and white that were, while they were divided along racial lines, were very much both being exploited.
And how did that play out as you saw it?
Well, it was not tidy. It was not neat. There were racial tensions. It was very interesting because the white people felt an attitude that you would encounter was whites saying, the black people are the ones that know how to organize here. The black people know how to stick together. These sorry white folks, we just can't stick together. But the black folks understand sticking together. So there was a respect. It was an attitude I saw often of a respect for black people's resilience and ability to stand up against the man. But it was a rough road, because when you came to decisions about who's going to get have strike benefits and the money that was coming in from the international to support the effort, you had local leaders making decisions about that, and there were, sadly, racial views got played out in that, or who's kin to who. I got very disillusioned at a certain point about the foibles of humanity, and it was it was a huge learning experience, and ultimately the efforts did not, we didn't win. We worked strike lines right on the edge of the swamp, and snakes galore in swampy eastern North Carolina, and met some people there that became lifetime friends, fellow organizers, and by then we were full time. Gene was actually full time staff. Back in those days, they got the wife for free. I worked without getting paid, but the battle was not won. Let me just say that it was hard fought, but we didn't prevail. The textile workers had to fold their tents, but so that then we were in a full blown strike with people out on picket lines, trying to stop scabs from going into work in rural. Very rural North Carolina. I got a lot out of that, but I also had a rude introduction to a less idealized understanding of people and their foibles, and there were a lot of disappointments in that strike. But it, looking back on it, we were very young. I learned valuable lessons and a much more nuanced way of understanding the white working class experience in this country. And you know, and a fundamental understanding of the critical role of organizing the workers and battling in inside union organizations for racial equality and gender equality. So, yeah, it was a very rich decade of learning life lessons. I will just say that.
And when you come to Atlanta, what were y'all doing for earning an income when you first arrived?
Well, I was thinking about that the other day. I don't quite recall all the sequence. I was, when we first came to Atlanta, I worked at Rich's, at the bookstore in Rich's. That's right. Which was heaven for an English major because they let you take books home at night and take books on your break. And yeah, the old downtown Rich's store. I worked in under a very prominent, famous woman, Faith. I believe it's Faith Brumley, but who had run their bookstore forever and a day, was kind of an iconic figure, and that was a source of income. It didn't cost a lot to live back in those days either. And then at a certain point when the Bird got established, we paid ourselves, minuscule salaries. We were living at, let us just say, having a healthy income was not high on our list of priorities. You figured out how to make do. And a lot of people lived together, living arrangements and shared rent, so on and so forth. We always had our own place. And I, at some point, went to work for ACLU, the regional office here. Chuck Morgan was running the regional office, and there were incredible cases that we were working on, and I became the office manager, and it was a real privilege to work in that setting. And I mean, he was working on Muhammad Ali's case. He was working on Howard Levy's case, conscientious objector case. Howard Levy was a doctor who was imprisoned for not going in for refusing the draft. And I mean, I would fly the briefs up to file with the Supreme Court. I mean, they were doing the one man, one vote. I mean, this Southern Regional Office of the ACLU was doing incredible legal work, and that was a real wonderful opportunity to both meet a lot of people in journalism who gathered around Chuck Morgan. They had their big, happy hour in the office late in the afternoon. But Hal Gulliver, who was a journalist here, who not that long ago passed away, was one of the journalists that gathered around Chuck Morgan. Reber Bolt was a brilliant young attorney who became very involved with the Bird, and to this day is one of our number. So that was a terrific experience, and I don't recall how long I worked there, but it was again very very rich opportunity. I also then went to work for Emory Legal Services. The legal services institution had been built out across the country, and there were legal services offices, and Emory had one out just off campus. And there I was the secretary to Maynard Jackson, who was a young legal services lawyer. And he launched his run for U.S. Senate while he was working there as a legal services attorney against Herman Talmadge. Quite a bold move. And so that's when I first got to know Maynard as his secretary. and that was around, I guess, around 1970. So I worked numbers of jobs like that to bring in income. Gene, I believe, mainly worked on the bird payroll. I guess you all are going to interview him.
I did interview him.
He doesn't talk long.
No, he does not. We had a 2 to 3 hour interview.
Okay. Yeah. He's not as loquacious as I am. So we were married for 4 years. And that is how we met. I believe that's the last question you asked me, how we met.
Yeah, so I'll follow that with how'd y'all fall into the bird? Come to know
you asked if we had many, about who had his friends. Howard and Ann Romaine. Howard and Ann and I had all been in the Virginia Civil Rights Project, the VSCRC. Howard was a Mississippi summer volunteer, a Louisiana boy who was at school up in Memphis, and then went on to after Mississippi summer. They were assigned. He and Gene were assigned, along with Ed Hamlet, and some other folks, to try to launch a white folks project, as they called it, in coastal Mississippi, looking for any ways to seek out and influence moderate whites, and I believe it was Gulfport, but I didn't know them then. I knew of that project, but I didn't know any of them because I was Atlanta based, and they were already out in the field, and they had somewhere in that mix they were launching SOC as well, maybe in the wake of that summer project, Southern Student Organizing Committee, and that was underway because I met Sue Thrasher coming through the SNCC office that summer, and it was a concept that was being constructed to form this group to work on white Southern campuses, and to be an organization that reached out to white students and activists to be a voice for progress in the South. So Gene and Howard, met then, connected then, and were working on SOC, and so Howard then came up to the university for graduate work at Virginia in Charlottesville, and we were both there. I was back on my campus at Mary Washington. He was at Charlottesville, and we were kind of spearheaders of bringing together the effort to launch work in Black Belt counties in Virginia with SNCC's help, and had a big December 64 conference at Hampton Institute in Virginia to formalize and launch an organization to do that work. And so Howard met and married Ann Romaine at graduate school. They were part of the first summer that we were in Southside, summer of '65 in Southside, Virginia, and then we had worked to raise those. Our two student organizations on those two campuses, Charlottesville and Mary Washington, worked together and collaborated post summer of '64, and by that Christmas we had founded our organization and were raising supplies to take to Mississippi to support the organizing work that was going on there post Mississippi summer. And so I do not know what was behind it, but Howard Romaine and Ann Romaine relocated to Atlanta, and we were all here at the same time, living within a couple of blocks of each other. Yeah. And as I say, I do not recall the trajectory of events that brought Howard and Ann to Atlanta. But have you interviewed Howard yet?
Mm-mm.
Do you have him on your list?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Actually, he's planning to come down to Atlanta.
Oh, good.
Fairly soon. I mean, we can talk about this later, but I don't know if you all have reached out to him.
We have been we were trying to get him for the bird reunion in June,
And he didn't come.
Yeah, and he wasn't able to.
He's now talking about coming down here soon. He's up at his daughter's in North Carolina. I was in touch with him over the weekend, and Atlanta is in the near future for him. So you should probably take advantage of that opportunity to get him. So at any rate, they were here, and he can tell his own story about whatever brought him here. Southern National Student Association or whatever. I just don't recall. If you told me about it, I would remember it all. But so we were all together socializing, and somehow Tom and Stephanie Coffin arrived in town from Reed College in Oregon I believe on motorcycles, but they certainly had them when they were here. He certainly had they certainly had at least one, if not two. They had one motorcycle, probably not two. But the point is, somehow the six of us got together and began the work of building on this desire to put out a paper to promote progressive ideas, anti-war ideas and anti-corporate hegemony ideas, and challenge the AJC. So that's how that happened, is that we had, I guess Tom came here maybe to go to Emory, maybe to do graduate work at Emory. And how that connection happened exactly, I don't recall. But at a certain point, the six of us were getting together and talking about this and working toward it. I don't claim primary. I was not the jump starter on that. I was part of a group, and I think it's safe to say that Howard and Tom and Gene were very imbued with the concept, and I certainly was a supporter of it, but I was not the originator of it.
And had you had any experience in high school, your Y work, college, all the SNCC, SOC, in any sort of publishing for?
Well, I had been in the communications office of SNCC and had been exposed to the importance of having a message and putting it out there and getting in the media. So I'd had some media exposure, and I was a writer of sorts. I was an English major. So that's pretty much the extent of it, and others brought, I'm sure, their own perspectives and experience on that, but we weren't stymied by the fact that we'd not done this before. It's like we were going to figure out how to do it.
And what roles did you play on the Bird once? So, were you involved in the precursor to the Bird, the Great American Review? I think
no.
So the inaugural Bird issue is March '68, I think.
March or April, yeah.
Yeah. What roles did you play in the production of the Bird?
It changed from time to time, and as you've heard, I worked other jobs. I was showing up and working full time at other jobs during that period. So I was definitely not always full time at the Bird. I was a big in the production of the copy, that is getting the articles set up for to actually appear in a newspaper. I was hands-on typist. I mean, that was a huge. That was something I loved to do, and I did it. And we had they called it a composer.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a lot of copy, getting copies set up in the form. I did a little bit of reporting. I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself on reporting. I did some, but really I would say scant. I was very active in organizing the women inside the co-op to have more equal roles and to challenge male supremacy, stomp it out wherever we saw it, and it was everywhere. So we had a very active internal life in the co-op and endless meetings. And so I was very involved in those inner workings. I never played an editor role. I weighed in with opinions on shaping decisions about the direction. And when I look back on that period, we spent endless time in internal debate and argument about, and it wasn't all productive, let me just say, but we were struggling ourselves within our ranks, particularly for women's equality, and also supporting each other as women and bonding as women. And we put out some women's issues on more than one occasion, and in which women played a primary role in crafting the articles and selecting the copy. And some of the women, Stephanie Coffin, notably Linda Fibben, there were people whose long and strong suit was on the look of the bird, the graphic design. That was never my forte. I was copy oriented, and there were those who did that thankless task of selling ads for the bird. Again, that's not nothing that I was ever strongly involved in. The internal life of the co-op, I was quite engaged in, and the decision-making conversations about what to cover, what needed covering, how we were evaluating our work, and what we needed to change or improve or do differently. I played a role in those kinds of conversations and decision making, and I was infrequently a full-time staffer there. I really would have to sort out how much time I actually spent in other work settings versus all the time that I spent at the Bird, a lot of which would have been volunteer time and nights and weekends and working around a job. Because I had at least 3 paying jobs during that time period. And then ultimately, by 71, I had gone to work in a plant doing labor organizing at Nabisco. Mm-hmm. So July 71, actually. And I had taken a position with the Vince Ramus Brigade, which was a national organization, and we were organizing for trips to Cuba, taking activists, North American activists, to Cuba to oppose the embargo and support the efforts to have Cuba be on its feet and standing up against all the efforts to shut it down that were led by the U.S. And so.
And is this 69?
Actually, it was 69. The Vince Ramus Brigade sent brigades to Cuba for some years. We had a Liberation News Service that was like the wire service for the independent press. Have you heard about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so on LNS, we would get feed from them all the time, and the Vince Ramus Brigade recruitment was done through that channel as well as others, but that's where I saw it, and and I was very taken with the idea of the opportunity to go to Cuba as part of a youth brigade, and Gene was unconvinced and dismissive, and so I said, and he said, "You can do it. I'm not doing it." Well, so I said, "I'm doing it," and I went ahead and applied, and much to his chagrin. And ultimately, they needed someone in the South to screen recruits and applicants from this part of the country. So I stepped into that role with Vince Ramus Brigade, and kind of built out the southern contingent. You just handled applications and interviewed people from this part of the country, and then we ultimately left for Cuba from Atlanta. And my gosh, we took a bus to Mexico City and then got on a plane to Havana. But I got very involved in organizing, and that trip got delayed for whatever reason. I think from fall of '69, we actually wound up going down there early 1970, maybe January through March of '70. So it was a significant trip. It was 6 or 8 weeks, and it involved going out in cane fields, in brigades, and there were it was a huge there were a huge number. I think there were maybe 800 or 900 of us in that effort. It was the largest one ever. I don't think they ever did one of that size again, but but that again is an example of where I was doing something other than bird work or alongside bird work for some significant period of time in late '69. And other bird people went on future trips and so on and so forth. But I really moved in and out of my roles at the paper, changed and evolved. And it's funny today, when you look back on those times, you just showed up at the SNCC office or you showed up at the Bird. These were, very unstructured, shoot from the hip, figured out why you're doing it, sorts of efforts. And that's what we were doing at the Bird.
And were you the only person from the Bird that year that went on the Vince Ramus Brigade trip?
It's good. I don't remember. I know other people that went later. Steve Wise may have been on that trip that I went on, but it was a massive group, and I actually, when I came home, because we took a cattle, a retrofitted cattle boat, cattle cargo boat up the East Coast to Canada to come back into the U.S. And I came from disembarking in St. John's, Canada, and came down to New Haven, where there was big demonstrations going on, a big SDS event, a huge gathering there with teach-ins and anti-war efforts. That was March of '70, and Tom Coffin and Ted Brodak had driven up to be at those demonstrations, and I rode back to Atlanta with them. And so I don't believe that there were other Atlanta folk, bird folk with me on that, or we would have all been together. But memory is a heck of a thing. Plays real tricks on you. And of course, lots of people, Bob Goodman, Steve Wise, and others. Steve could have been on that trip, but I kind of doubt it. But many people ultimately took advantage of that opportunity for the Vince Ramus Brigade. I mean, some people came back to Atlanta that I'd met there Vicky Gabriner among them, to live and work in Atlanta. That where we'd first connected in the cane fields of Cuba.
Mm. And what did that experience mean for you at the time?
Well, it's interesting. I had huge debates with Cubans around gay rights. Now, the very early organizing efforts were taking shape, in places like Atlanta by 1970. They've gone back and documented it, but I don't recall the very first gay pride march, but I was in the early gay pride marches, and there was debate in the left movement in this country. There was not vast disagreement. Vast agreement. There was not vast agreement and embracing of efforts for gay rights. There were big disagreements, and I was always on the side of gay rights is the next civil rights iteration of the civil rights movement, and had vigorous debates in Cuba with the Cubans that were staffing us in Cuba around whether gay rights was whether the battle for gay rights was reactionary or revolutionary. Yeah, so that was a significant, kind of ideologically significant thing to me from that trip, and of course we met people from other nations that were there. Had that opportunity. We toured the island. We were in 22 brigades. And we divided up into work brigades to go out and work in the fields. And so I certainly tested the limits of physical endurance while there, and meeting progressives from all over the country, and then connecting with people internationally, and very much, getting an opportunity to understand the Cuban experience and the Cuban vantage point, and of the way the U.S. was pushing around Cuba and trying to shut down its democratic revolution. So I came back much more imbued with an understanding of struggles going on around the world for democracy. Really opened my eyes to that. It was a very valuable experience. And of course, the wonderful experience of the Cuban people. Fell in love with Cuba and the culture and the art and the music. And they were already, sometimes you conflate your memories, but I think already they were embracing much more medical, universal medical services, and placing a priority on training people to bring health services to Cubans all across the country. I didn't have a very critical view of Russia's role at that time. You can look back on it and see very much how the Russian role was deforming the Cuban economy, and so it was an incredible eye-opening experience from all those aspects, and I came back definitely encouraging other people to do that, and being very supportive of the Vince Ramus experience.
Well, I think we're coming up.
You have a 1 o'clock.
I have a 1 o'clock, and
yeah.
So I think that we'll stop here, and hopefully we'll be able to pick back up, because there are you have a whole lifetime of excitement that we could talk about. But there's certainly some more things around the bird that I would like to touch on.
Okay.